Do you feel this back there?
In 1991, Metallica released their monstrously successful Black Album.
Stupid question. Are you alive?
When Metallica first released the Black Album, they got a lot of criticism. A lot of people within the metal community said that they had sold out, that they had gone too commercial, they've abandoned their metal roots, so to speak. Where do you draw the line between selling out and expressing yourself artistically? If you are a struggling musician and you're trying to make money to support yourself, in that case, do what you have to do. A lot of people are pointing at the fact that Metallica are not struggling. They were not struggling at the time. So why did they have to change? Why did they have to go more commercial? Is going commercial necessarily selling out? I don't think so. I think you can tell clearly when someone's totally abandoned their artistic integrity and they're just doing it for money. So where is the line between selling out and being an artist and growing? Where is that line?
A sellout to me would be doing something you don't want to do just for money. That means you're selling out of what do you want to do. You're doing this other thing because you just want to make money. You don't want to do it, but you're going to do it because you want to make money. So I'm pretty sure, watching documentaries on Metallica and the Black Album, they wanted to do that record. So I would never call Metallica sellouts for doing the Black Album. I think it also just comes from people just preferred Master of Puppets or, And Justice for All.
Obviously, Metallica transcended it all, but they didn't even make their first video until the And Justice record. The folklore about them, the people tell their friends and their kids, and it just the legend grows.
You will hear Metallica if you put on classic rock radio today.
I still consider Metallica a metal band. I don't know if I really consider them a classic rock band.
That's something I was just talking about to somebody like 2 days ago. I think that's an answer that I'm looking for. I really don't know what is the defining thing that makes it metal or rock.
I can tell I'm old because I've got a Motorhead coffee cup, but we love Lemmy, we love the band. And my Iron Maiden coaster.
That is awesome.
Did we get distracted a little bit here?
But I think what happens is every once in a while you have these metal acts that cross over and become so big that then they have to become accepted by classic rock. Great example of that would be Metallica with something like Enter Sandman. Eventually, if not already, that is considered classic rock, and that does get played on classic rock radio. That's the only Metallica song that's going to get played on classic rock, but it's become so big that where once it was considered a metal thing, now it's considered a classic rock thing. It happens all the time, and it really just speaks to the way these songs hold up and how the lens they're looked at in 20 years on after they've come out. And if it's looked at as something that's still stood the test of time and that was impactful enough at the time, okay, we can start to kind of spoon feed that to the classic rock audience.
I remember when Eric Carr first was getting into Metallica, and for me, it was very, frantic double bass drum, crazy a bit, Master of Puppets and earlier stuff, and I was kind of like, I didn't really relate. Then all of a sudden they do an album with, I think it was Mick Rock, and it's like the Black Album, it's just like, wow, this is powerful and amazing. They moved it in a little bit, or got closer to like an AC/DC, right?
I could just ask you. I know a lot of artists within the metal scene were really thrown off when Metallica did the Black Album, just to kind of strayed away from the thrash roots. As an artist, do you think there's anything wrong with a musician straying away from what their fans want? They're in it for themselves, not the fans, right? So how do you feel about the relationship from an artist and the fans?
Well, for me, I really enjoyed it, what they did, because I didn't like the thrash roots. Eric Carr did. Maybe it was the excitement of the drumming, I don't know. I just think that they got broader. They certainly used the right producer, the sounds. To me, when someone makes a left turn just for the money, it's just not going to really be convincing. I think you're going to see right through it. It's not going to feel right. It's not going to be that powerful. Meanwhile, they blew the roof off with that. So they obviously tapped into something that was legitimate for them, even though Could you tell they were a thrash band before that? Probably not. But it worked for them. So that's the good thing about music is when you're sincere with it, it really connects much more with more people. And when you're just kind of like faking it, you know, people are not going to really accept it. It's just not going to, certainly won't stand the test of time.
When a heavy metal artist or song gets embraced by classic rock, it kind of mainstreams it out to some degree. It's not so metal anymore.
Yeah.
You talk about AC/DC. It's kind of like hard to think that something like You Shook Me All Night Long at one point was considered some sort of metal thing. I'll give you an example. When I got into radio, I started radio in '83. And when I got into radio, I wanted to do something called a metal show on the radio. Nobody was really doing anything like that at the time. There's only maybe one or two other ones. And I was working at a record store. And it was across the street from the radio station. And the owners of the store would come in all the time. And I was selling records. This was '83. I was selling records from 3 bands that they weren't playing, that they weren't touching on the radio.
Which bands were these?
Def Leppard, who had just put out Pyromania. Quiet Riot, who had just put out Mental Health. And the first Metallica record.
Kill 'Em All?
Kill 'Em All. And all these records were selling and doing well, but radio wouldn't touch them. And when the owners would come in, I'd say, hey, how come you guys aren't playing this stuff? And they would be like, oh, that's, you know, we don't do heavy metal on the station. We can't. It's too alienating, whatever. So I said, but you know, we're selling tons of it. I'm here selling. People are buying it. They must want to hear it. No. So that's the way I got my show on the air, was by pushing them to give me an outlet to play this stuff. They said, okay, we'll give you 3 hours a week, come up and play it. Now, that's '83. If you flash forward and you think to yourself, 2 of those records for sure, Mental Health and Pyromania, went on to sell millions and millions of records shortly after that. Now, there's songs from both of those records that are considered to be classic rock songs. Mm-hmm. But back then, they were songs that they were so abrasive that they didn't know what to do with them. But as my point is that as time goes on, this stuff is viewed under a different lens. It's looked at differently, and it's looked at like, well, it stood the test of time. It's not so abrasive anymore. There's people that like it. It's grown. It's like it's taken on a whole new life. It's looked at in a whole different way.
The same reason that you hear heavy metal bands like Metallica on classic rock radio stations is the same reason you hear grunge bands like Nirvana on classic rock radio stations. It's the fact that they have this relevancy and that they mean so much to the fans. There is a resonance about the popularity of any type of music. And as it continues in its popularity as we move forward into the future, the nice thing about human beings is that we continue to grow and populate and, you know, produce and stuff. So we get really excited about the music that we like no matter what era it's from. And if we keep it alive, that's the kind of stuff on classic rock radio that prevents it from becoming oldies music. You heard me talking at one point about the idea of classic rock being something in a museum as opposed to something in a gallery. Museums are not a bad thing. If you want to talk about old music, classic rock music, that's museum stuff. You want to talk about classic rock radio and the progression of music as it goes along, doesn't matter who you're listening to. As I mentioned, whether it's Metallica or whether it's Nirvana or any of the grunge bands, that stuff remains relevant.
A song like Crazy Train's been around so long. When it first came out, it was considered this metal song. And then through airplay and exposure in other ways, Crazy Train is played every football game here in America. So that mainstreams it out. It gets so ingrained in the consciousness of people. It's just like, oh, that's just, it becomes classic rock as opposed to what it started out, which was metal.
The radio station will play whatever music that they think will get them ratings. And they won't play music that they think will turn people off. Believe me, if anything from Rain and Blood worked on a classic rock radio station, you could bet that classic rock radio station would have done their research to find out whether or not it did, and if it did do well, they'd be playing it.
Where is the line between metal and hard rock? How do you start to distinguish the two?
In my opinion, where the line is drawn between metal and classic rock really has to do with the guitar playing. I mean, as a guitar player, that is my opinion. And it really has to do kind of with the overdrive or the distortion in the guitar. It's like when you listen, to Bad Company, yeah, it's a Les Paul and a Marshall, but it's a different Les Paul and a Marshall than, Metallica. Metallica is just so much more overdriven, crazy pentatonic scales and things like that, and whammy bars and things like that. I can pinpoint the difference of the bands, who I think is metal and who I think is classic rock, and I guess trying to define the word or the description is actually difficult, but to me it's in the guitar playing. Is the guitar player a metal guitar player, or is the guitar player a rock and roll guitar player? And I guess when we were talking earlier about blues based, that's absolutely the borderline. To me, all those bands, Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Sabbath, all were major blues influenced bands. But later on, once Eddie Van Halen came along, it really changed everything. Hendrix changed all those guys, but Eddie Van Halen changed all these guitar players. I think that when you ask a lot of the metal guitar players, are probably saying guys like Eddie Van Halen are more of an influence to them than Hendrix,
Where does that border begin between metal and, hard rock?
Well, it's a good question because I think that there is a difference between the two. Some people don't make a distinction. Some people just kind of put it all under one umbrella. That happened a lot in the 80s where people were like, everything from Def Leppard and Poison to Metallica and Megadeth were all just considered and called heavy metal. Even to this day, you'll see TV shows that are, Metal Mania Hour or whatever on VH1 Classic or whatever, and you'll see Bon Jovi in there, and you'll see Megadeth in there, and you'll see Anthrax in there, and you'll see Poison in there. It still goes into that big sort of melting pot, and I think that's one of the things that's caused it some problems because there is a distinct difference. To me, hard rock has more melody to it. It is more accessible, and it's just really rock music with just maybe a little bit more edge in the guitars. Metal, a lot of what makes metal to me is the presentation, and there's a lot more aggression in it. And visually, it's completely different. So it's very hard for me to put into words, but you can rattle off a band to me and I'll tell you right now, in my view, are they hard rock or are they metal? And to me, it's very clear cut. I don't know why, maybe just from doing this my whole life, I just kind of make it, in my mind, there's an immediate distinction.
Where does the border begin between hard rock and heavy metal, essentially? Like, how do you start to distinguish the two?
I think the border between hard rock and metal is really in the production of the sounds and the vocals. Metal is where more screaming, more yelling, more barking enters the equation rather than melody and kind of soaring vocals. And then production-wise, drums have a lot more attack in metal, guitars have a lot more aggression in metal. Hard rock is a little more accessible to the general public and radio, whereas metal, that's more of a genre. That's more, I don't want to use the word underground, but it's a focused style that kids either gravitate to or don't.
In the 70s, things sounded a little more natural, a little more raw. Those bands played live in the studio. That all changed in the 80s with technology. People started, doing instruments. A lot of times, obviously, in the 70s, people were recording things one at a time and really, going crazy with overdubs, especially bands like the Eagles or Fleetwood Mac. But I think production had a huge part in the change of the sound of metal. Once they could intricately go in and affect each instrument, the sounds got more aggressive, heavier, kind of nastier. And that once that hit the 90s, and then you had like Pantera and bands like that, they just took the tone of it to another level. So the vocal became more guttural, more screaming, like less singing, less melody. The guitar sounds became more like razor blades and just nasty and heavy. So to me, it's definitely more on a production level. If you took a Pantera song and produced it like, say, a Nickelback production, you know, it might have a totally different effect on people and probably wouldn't work. So I think that that's probably the biggest change, is just technology.
You know, Tom Werman, who produced us and produced Motley Crue and produced a bunch of bands, there was a certain sheen on the records which made them more commercially acceptable for radio, and maybe that didn't seem as heavy. I mean, you don't really get Metallica, you don't get Metallica or Motorhead on pop radio, but you got Twisted Sister and Motley Crue and Rat on pop radio. So was there a sound to the record? Sabbath, first album, was really heavy. Blue Cheers, first album, 68. They weren't called heavy metal back then. That was bludgeoningly heavy. Maybe the loudest album ever recorded. They did it on a pier, you know, in the middle of San Francisco Bay. I mean, that's how loud it was. They were super loud and super, super heavy. And Blood Rock and Sir Lord Baltimore are probably two bands that you don't even know who they are, but these bands were early kind of metal-ish bands. So there's a little of a blurring of the line, because a lot of heavy metal bands will say that metal is just blues rock turned up really loud. Is Zeppelin a metal band? Or is Zeppelin just a rock band? Or is they a hybrid rock metal band? I mean, they do folk songs, so therefore, how much metal could they be if half the songs are done with acoustic guitars? Are they metal because John Bonham was just the drummer from hell, you know, like the greatest drummer who ever lived, you know, and had that massive drum sound? I guess one can argue this point over and over again. The earlier metal bands tended, not always, because Sabbath certainly didn't do a ballad in the early days, nor did they use an acoustic guitar, but they tended to have some variety. I think once the line was crossed into Slade territory, the band Slade purely celebrated super heavy, loud rock. I mean, Slade was rock and roll, but metal. I mean, super, super loud, like heavy duty loud, like grindingly, punishingly, rebelliously, insanely loud. What's the difference in them and Motorhead? They were funny. They wrote much more hooky type songs, but if you ask Lemmy and Noddy Holder, they'd probably have mutual respect for each other for what they both did. Motorhead just kind of took it over the line in another direction that maybe have assumed to be heavier, but I don't know if they were any louder. Not if you actually compared the two's SPL levels, or Deep Purple for that matter, who I think hold the record for the loudest band on earth. They wouldn't be rolling off your tongue as a metal band. Deep Purple would be a hard rock band, you know? But Maiden is a metal band. So why is Maiden metal? Why is Deep Purple necessarily not metal per se? And how did Jethro Tull get the first metal Grammy at the Grammys?
Metal is just way more just intense, and like I'll use Metallica for instance. Like if you listen to And Justice for All, and then you listen to a hard rock band, it's a totally different thing. You know, a hard rock band is really blues based, singing about, you know, some girl's ass. Where Metallica is like super heavy, very complicated, and, you know, singing about totally different stuff, you know.
I think one of the defining moments in heavy metal, for me anyway, and it's an early song that I played as a young player, learning how to play with other people in bands, was Smoke on the Water. Because it was almost like, if you listen to that song, the way it's constructed, it starts out with the guitar riff, with the tone, even though there's a keyboard playing along with that, right? And it just has that bombastic sound, which really grabs you right away. And then it shows you how to construct a really clever heavy metal riff. And, you know, okay, let's add a hi-hat. Right. Let's add the kick drum. Here's the bass guitar, right? Isn't that the way that goes? And now we're the build. And it's kind of funny, because if you just break down the intro of that song, it's not the standard issue eighth notes that we got used to later on, you know, throughout the late 70s and into the 80s. But it still gave you a good sense of, like, that's what those tones are like. And I think that might be more defining as far as what classic heavy metal is than, you know, certainly things that you hear today, which to me, I get a little lost just because the tuning goes way below the floor. And I love low end, but I have no idea what we're tuned to anymore.
So does the gridding. Is the what? The gridding on the grid.
The gridding, oh yeah, the gridding goes right, yeah. But I think there's something to classic heavy metal, but we're talking about another genre. I don't think it necessarily, it crosses over, it doesn't sit in the same pantheon of classic rock. I think classic rock is still severely blues-based, right? It's one honest voice, like the guy, whoever's singing has that honest blues man's voice.
It's not as dark.
Yeah, And lyrically, I think lyrically, you know, once we start kind of straddling the comic book world of heavy metal, you know, which is basically what a lot of early stuff is, where they start talking about more spectral things like, you know, darker notions and supernatural things.
Right.
You know, what
Well, Zeppelin kind of did that though too.
Yeah, I guess. So maybe disproved, maybe not. I'm not sure, but
it's all a blender.
Yeah, but the point is you know, is heavy metal, classic heavy metal, you know, throughout the 70s and into the early 80s, is that considered a classic rock movement as well?
It's hard for me because, you know, again, it's not that I care about aging myself, but it always seemed that the classic rock was the 70s, you know, and the Zeppelin.
Right.
You know, like I said, the Neil Young, that type of stuff was
Right.
always kind of the category of classic rock.
So I get one honest voice, one honest guitar amp, you know, one honest drum set in the room.
So I would say, you know, metal is, again, a British thing, you know, and you got bands like Priest and, you know, Thin Lizzy might have touched on it. And I think actually The Sweet was 1973 or something. There's a song called Sweet F.A. and they have this rhythm, it's dun 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 dun, which is the Iron Maiden gallop. And I've wanted to research this a little bit more, but to my knowledge, that's really the first time that groove was in a rock song. And then Led Zeppelin copped it for Achilles' Last Stand. But that's a very, very metal type of thing, you know? But yeah, I would say, you know, 77, 78, and metal has a bit of punk in it too, you know? There's a bit of, you know, early Iron Maiden, especially with Paul Di'Anno singing, has that. And then when you get into Judas Priest and as Maiden progressed, the two guitars, which is a template laid down by Thin Lizzy, and before that I think it was Status Quo. You know, there's a lot of history there.
Well, when I was a kid, and I date back to the early origins of metal, I mean, Deep Purple and Sabbath were the metal bands. And you listen to Deep Purple now, and it's very blues-based, boogie rock. I think what really is essentially the attitude and some of the lyrical content where, you know, with Deep Purple and Sabbath, obviously we know mostly Sabbath's lyrical content was just about, you know, struggles and, you know, darkness and, you know, even to the fact of like spirituality and things of that nature. And Deep Purple was about cars and, you know, life road, and it wasn't, they weren't love songs. So later on, especially with the 80s, hair metal bands were more about, like, you know, getting laid music. And, you know, I mean, not that that didn't exist with bands like Free and Bad Company, but it was a less focus on the dark. And, you know, Cream, you know, there was a sort of psychedelia with the lyrics and sort of like acid trip vibe on what they were singing about. And you really don't know that much. And they didn't really have the essential love songs neither. So there was a certain hardness and darkness, lyrical content, and focus on the riff more than you know, what people were looking like. Eventually, later 80s music was, you know, a lot more involved with, you know, the image of the group, etc. You know, big technical guitar solos, and, you know, and trying to bring the chicks in a lot more.
Metal from hard rock or the hard rock thing. I mean, it's man, that's an open book. You know, that can go all day long. I mean, you know. The dual guitars, you know, Skinner did it, Lizzy did it, you know, fans in North America, you know, Status Quo, huge band globally, except in North America. That was basically their trademark. You look at their live shots from the early 70s, and you will see that line of guitars going right across like this. Blue Oyster Cult also, you know, big at doing that as well. And why the hell didn't I mention Iron Maiden too, right? We can't do this thing without mentioning Iron Maiden, one of the greatest bands of all time. But, you know, I think the thing is, and Motorhead too, we cannot forget about Motorhead. You know, I can tell I'm old because I've got a Motorhead coffee cup, but, you know, we love Lemmy, we love the band. Oh, and my Iron Maiden coaster.
That is awesome.
Did we get distracted a little bit here? Yeah, I know, as I said, it's an open book with that stuff. I mean, you know, hard rock, heavy metal.
I just think that metal in general is always kind of marginalized and always put into a little compartment. But I think what happens is every once in a while you have these metal acts that cross over and become so big that then they have to become accepted by classic rock. Great example of that would be Metallica with something like Enter Sandman. Eventually, if not already, that is considered classic rock, and that does get played on classic rock radio. That's the only Metallica song that's going to get played on classic rock, but it's become so big that where once it was considered a metal thing, now it's considered a classic rock thing. It happens all the time, and it really just speaks to the way these songs hold up and how the lens they're looked at in 20 years on after they've come out. And if it's looked at as something that's still stood the test of time and that was impactful enough at the time, okay, we can start to kind of spoon feed that to the classic rock audience. And I think that's really all that it's about. I think when you look at the umbrella of classic rock, you're going to find everything from, Love is a Battlefield by Pat Benatar, which is basically a pop song, to You Shook Me All Night Long, to Welcome to the Jungle, to Crazy Train. Crazy Train is certainly metal. It was considered metal when it came out. It's a metal song, but it's now accepted by classic rock, and to me it just becomes a rock song. So it's not about, I think when you get into the realm of classic rock and you become, a song reaches that sort of level, the categories that originally existed in are thrown out. Doesn't matter anymore. It's just, now it's classic rock. The band could still be considered metal or what have you, and it might be the only song that makes it into that sort of umbrella, but when you get to the point of it being classic rock, it's just classic rock at that point. You've arrived, there's been enough put into it that it's like enough research done, enough acceptance to the song that it's like, okay, this is just classic rock now. A song like Crazy Train's been around so long. When it first came out, it was considered this metal song. And then through airplay and exposure in other ways, Crazy Train is played every football game here in America, every sporting event coming out of a timeout. The players walk out, they play Crazy Train for whatever reason. It's the introduction theme, just like Welcome to the Jungle. There's so many teams. So that mainstreams it out. It gets so ingrained in the consciousness of people. It's just like, oh, that's just, it becomes classic rock as opposed to what it started out, which was metal. So it's just stuff that happens over time, shows up in movies, shows up in sporting events. You know what, I never really played that song before on my radio show. I'm going to start playing it. Maybe that happens 25 years ago. And then they play it. And then the next guy, the competing radio station in town says, wait a minute, he's playing Crazy Train now? He's doing well with playing that? I better play it. The music industry, like many industries, is incredibly copycat. So if they see success somewhere, everybody's going to try to imitate it and duplicate it. It only takes a couple people to take the risk, and then others will just jump on. And if they have success with it, they'll chase it. It's the time, things change, things evolve, and a lot of it has to do with perception. It really does.
Where's the borderline in your mind from what is rock and what is metal? Is it possible to find a border?
That is such a great question, because that's something I was just talking about to somebody like 2 days ago. I think that's an answer that I'm looking for. I really don't know what is the defining thing that makes it metal or rock. I mean, just look at Metallica. When they first started off, they were metal. I mean, you listen to them now, they're pussy country rock, whatever the hell you want to call them. It's like, I just don't know anymore. I think that I love AC/DC too. I'm a huge AC/DC fan, and Zeppelin. So it's to me, that's a puzzle. I definitely think that the public has a lot to do with defining what's metal and what's rock. And then the public is influenced and manipulated by the radio stations. The radio programmers, they just put something in a box, in a category, put it out there, and then they put it on a classic rock station or a metal station. So, I don't know, for me it's a mystery. Really something I've wondered about so often. What is the difference?
An interesting question to me has always been, where do you draw the line between hard rock and heavy metal? And some people categorize certain music as one or the other. I don't always agree with it. It's like, well, that's heavier than that, and you're calling that heavy metal, and that hard rock. But this hard rock song to me sounds heavier than, and it's like, well, and there again, that's the musical terminology maybe we all interpret it a little differently too, and so it's never going to be very precise, you know.
A radio station will play whatever music that they think will get them ratings, and they won't play music that they think will turn people off. Believe me, if anything from Rain and Blood worked on a classic rock radio station, you could bet that that classic rock radio station would have done their research to find out whether or not it did, and if it did do well, they'd be playing it. Something like Megadeth has a hard time translating to commercial radio because it can be so polarizing with the audience. If you had to look at all the permutations of rock and roll, the two biggest subcultures, I think, planet-wise, would have to be goth on one side and metal on the other. Metal is something that has been with us since sometime in the middle 60s, and it's pentatonic blues done at various speeds, basically. And it's music to expend energy, to expend rage, to just lose your mind to. And there's something primal about metal. And the primal nature of metal has allowed it to survive a lot longer than a lot of other genres. And it is okay. Metal has always had this long history, so that it has always been okay to go back and acknowledge the masters. So if you're into death metal today, or some kind of black metal, or even some speed or thrash or whatever, you do pay homage to the greats like Led Zeppelin, like Black Sabbath. I mean, you just have to, because the music that you're listening to today would not exist without the past masters. So there is a respect for the past when it comes to metal. I mean, for example, we'll look when Lemmy died, the outpouring of mourning from people all across the metal spectrum, because hey, Motorhead was there before Metallica. No Motorhead, no Metallica. In fact, in some cases, no Motorhead, no Foo Fighters. So, but there is some of that metal, the more melodic metal, that managed to cross over onto rock radio in the 1970s. I remember hearing Ace of Spades on a straight-ahead rock and roll FM radio station. Def Leppard, Iron Maiden, they all had this melodic sound, this melodic metal that worked well on the radio. If you have, a four-on-the-floor beat, big, powerful, layered guitars, and a screaming vocalist with a good melody, you got a chance. I think your overriding umbrella term is heavy metal. And from that, you have a different, a vast variety of subgenres. Hard rock is a form of heavy metal. It's just done in the style of AC/DC. You know when you hear it.
Which came first, metal or hard rock?
Which came first, metal or hard rock? That's a good question. They sort of rose simultaneously in the 1960s. I would say that hard rock, or harder rock, or what used to be called acid rock, may have come first, with groups like Cream and 13th Floor Elevators and Blue Cheer in the middle 60s. And we really didn't start using the term heavy metal until Steppenwolf came along and Born to Be Wild. Like Smoke and Lightning, Heavy Metal Thunder. And from there, we kind of adopted that phrase because it was so damn good.
So you'll get people arguing this point. If you love all this music and you know the differences, you may go, they're metal, they're not metal. There was a band called the Young Ones. It's a comedy troupe in England. So pre-Spinal Tap, they did a movie called The Bad News Tour, which preceded Spinal Tap, I think, a year, in which the Young Ones were a fake metal band called Spider. And so they were being filmed by somebody to show what it was like touring the world. And it was there's a scene in that movie, and I haven't seen it in 30 years, so I hope I don't get it wrong. But there's a scene in the movie in which a journalist from some rock magazine is interviewing the guitar player and the singer in the back of their van as they're driving to a gig. And the question is, how do you describe your band? And one of them says, we're hard rock, and the other one says, we're heavy metal. And they have an argument in the van, and it's done to show the ridiculousness of labeling. And one of them says, we're hard rock. No, we're not. We're heavy metal. No, we're not. We're hard rock. And the guy goes, well, I'm getting out of this van. I'm not getting back in the van until you say we're heavy metal. It's one of those ridiculous kind of conversations that have been taking place for 30 years. So I don't know. I'd say Twisted Sister is definitely metal. How heavy? Well, compared to death metal bands, maybe not. You know, we're what are we in Motley Crue? We're pop metal. I mean, because we had some hit songs. Are we pop metal? It's Rat. You know, are we metal?
So what sounds sonically start to distinguish what is metal and hard rock in your mind?
Production values on certain albums.
The border between hard rock and metal is, I think, in my mind, it's when you get into like Metallica and stuff like that becomes metal, and the hard rock stuff is, to me, is like AC/DC and stuff like that. I just call it all rock and roll, so I don't really do good with labels. So I'm kind of over labels because people try to label stuff every few years about something new that comes out. So I'm just like, it's music.
Commercial success vis-a-vis pop radio destroys or hurts your career in the eyes of the so-called super metal fans whose older brothers don't want the younger brothers to like their music. I remember when We're Not Going to Take It Across the Threshold from 19-year-old metal fans to 8-year-old fans, and it scared the hell out of me. We were in the middle of our Stay Hungry tour, and we were in Philadelphia, and we were playing at the Spectrum, and I went across the street to the Veterans Memorial Coliseum because the Mets, I'm a Mets fan, they were playing the Phillies.
By the way.
Yeah. Well, we got to the World Series.
Yeah, we got to the ALCS.
Okay. So I'm in the stands, and we're in the middle of the tour, so I had my hair turned back. I had a hat on so nobody would recognize me. And I'm sitting there, and while I'm sitting there eating a hot dog in between innings, an older brother, the two brothers, I'm assuming they're brothers. Guy looked like he's 19, the kid looked like he's 8. They're walking up the stairs, and the kid's going, "We're not gonna take it. We're not." And the brother's looking at him, going, "Shut up!" And I'm thinking to myself, "Oh my God, we just lost that guy. Like we lost him. Are we going to lose more?" It really scared the hell out of me because we had crossed over that line. And then that October, I was watching some college football game, Michigan versus Ohio State or something, and the band comes out in between, and they go, dun, 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 dun. I was like, oh God, it's really over. I mean, we're done. That scares the crap out of you because then you realize that once you have the mothers and the kids, and then you're no longer, horrible, and then that takes away your credibility. And so maybe metal has a lot to do with also what you wouldn't listen to. However, go to an AC/DC concert these days, and there's parents and their kids. It's not that far away, but AC/DC is acceptable.
Without a doubt, a lot of what happens in metal is not only in the music and the intensity and the speed of it, but also in the imaging. So I just think hard rock is a little bit more accessible to people. There's more melody to it. It doesn't have the imagery. It's not fire and crossbones and skulls and what have you. And that's really what metal is more about. Certainly, the heavy metal that we know now is completely different than the heavy metal that was considered heavy metal back in the 70s. Back in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't as in your face as it is now. It's like they're pushing the envelope to get more and louder and heavier and faster. And I think back then it was a little tamer. So when you look at classic rock, when we're playing stuff like Deep Purple, Highway Star, maybe back then that was considered, whoa, really heavy for the time, but now it's very tame in comparison. I mean, you look back at some of the bands that came out in the 70s that were considered heavy metal, like really heavy rock, and they are so light compared to the thrash sort of metal that we're used to now. So, and I think it was just really hard to draw a line between, and I don't think it's really fair to the bands. I don't think any band really wanted to be put in one specific genre and said, this is your sound and this is what you're limited to and this is what people expect from you. I don't think a lot of bands really like that. I think it's just, certainly different bands were influenced to do different things with their music.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkissian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.